Good afternoon, everyone, and a very sunny welcome here from London. My name is Claudia Ott. I'm from the Austrian Culture Forum London, and I'm also part of the EUNIC London presidency team. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone here today. Special thanks to Jessica Hausner, who has agreed to give the masterclass today. Thank you for doing that, and we're all very much looking forward to hearing more about your process of filming. Thank you also to Danny Lee, who has agreed to moderate, and thank you to the European Union Delegation to the UK, and to the National Film and Television School, who is partnering up with us on this masterclass. Just a brief introduction to what is EUNIC. So EUNIC is the European Union National Institute for Culture, and we are a group of cultural institutes and organizations who are promoting and collaborating with European and UK partners. And this masterclass is part of our In Short Europe Short Film Festival, with the third edition just finished a few weeks ago and had the theme of Happy Together. And we kind of wanted to broaden our reach, so to say, and I'm very happy that we were able to present this masterclass today. So that's it from me. I'm just gonna say thanks again to everyone. I'll see you later afterwards. I hope you enjoyed the masterclass, and I'll now hand over to Sandra from the National Film and Television School.
Thank you. Thanks, Claudia. I'm Sandra Hebron. I'm Head of Screen Arts at the National Film and Television School. And I too would very much like to welcome you to the masterclass and just say a few thank yous on our behalf. We're absolutely delighted to be working in partnership with the In Short Europe Short Film Festival and with EUNIC Union and with the European Union Delegation to the UK on this event. It feels perhaps more important than ever that those of us in the UK do maintain our cultural links with our European colleagues, and perhaps particularly in relation to film and filmmaking. And of course, it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to hear Jessica Hausner talk about her work. Jessica is a filmmaker whose work is always, I think, distinctive and intriguing, both very meticulously crafted and also very sort of singular in tone, very tonally unique. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Jessica speak, and I'm very pleased that NFTS students and alumni can hear Jessica, and also very pleased indeed that this event is opened up to a wider public too. I'd like to thank Shira McLeod, curator, and Anastasia Mina, coordinator, for initiating and organising the masterclass. And of course, thanks to Danny, who will be moderating, and our special thanks to Jessica. I'm going to hand over to Danny so we can get started. Danny, over to you.
Great, thank you, Sandra, and thank you to Claudia as well. Yes, welcome to this morning's online masterclass. We're here with Jessica Hausner, who, as Sandra said, is one of the most singular filmmakers working today in Europe, one of the most talented filmmakers as well, I think both in Europe and anywhere in the world, in fact. So thank you for joining us today, Jessica. You've built up this extraordinary body of work, and it feels like we have an hour, but there's a lot to discuss. But just to give that some context, I wanted to ask, first of all, about your childhood without making it like a therapy session. But I wanted to find out about your early days. I mean, your parents were both artists, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that. And I wondered whether growing up for you, whether art felt natural, almost inevitable, unavoidable as a later career?
Yes, I think art was a very important issue throughout my childhood. You already mentioned both my parents were visual artists, and we didn't see much of them because they were involved into their art every day. We only met in the evening for dinner, and during the dinner I remember all the discussions were always about other artists, fellow artists, and curators and the market. So my sister Tanya and me, we this was our everyday life. We grew up with those questions, not necessarily about art itself. It was very much also about the practical aspect of it. How do you sell a painting? Who bought it? For how much money? Why did that painting got bought at all? So my parents were very much discussing also about the practical side. And I have to say, sometimes I think this also helped me later, because I saw being an artist from a very practical side. How do you survive? How do you cope? How do you make money with it? I mean, and my parents were very, like, they went to work every day. They were not artists like who waited for the inspiration or something. They were very much like as if they were employees. They went to their working space in the morning, came back in the evening, every day the same hour. And on the weekends, they were reading and taking some time off. So they were as if they were employed at a normal office. And that gave me a specific idea also about how to cope with, also with those frightening aspects of being an artist. You're responsible for everything. No one hired you, no one's told you what to do. So I think when I grew up, I already learned a little bit about how to cope with that.
Yeah, it sounds like you were learning a kind of lesson in self-discipline and sort of creativity and self-discipline, kind of always being in conversation with each other.
Yes, absolutely. For example, my parents sometimes also discussed about, like, when the work didn't go well during the day. That was not good for my sister and me, because then they were in a very bad mood. But then the next day, the same passage in the painting went well, and suddenly my father, for example, was happy again. So we also were witnessing these ups and downs of making a piece of art, which is quite hard work.
So how did you discover cinema in that case? I mean, was that something that you stumbled on alone, or were your family part of that process?
I stumbled on it, if that's how you say it, alone. I think I had actually planned to become a writer. I was writing short stories, and at the age of 16 or something, a friend of mine, his father was working for the television, and they had a video camera at home. It was not, back then, it wasn't at all usual to have a video camera. No one had iPhones back then. We're talking about 1980s. And I asked to borrow that video camera, and we made little films out of my short stories. And I had no idea of where to put the camera. Nothing, ever heard of shot or counter shot. I knew nothing. We just put the camera. I told my boyfriend he was the actor, I was the cinematographer and director. And I loved it. It was so great to make a film. I enjoyed it much more than writing. And now, seen from nowadays, I think it was the visual language that immediately was more fluent for me than the written language. I think what I like to say, I can say it better with images than with words. And I think I felt that back then. And only after that experience, I started to watch films and to have a look, how did the others do it? How do you make a film? Yeah.
So for you, I mean, in that case, was film school and your film training kind of self-taught? I mean, was it simply a process of actually just like diving into the history of cinema and discovering film?
I have to admit that the first films that I then consciously sort of analyzed were the TV series I watched with my family in the evening, Dallas and Dynasty, the Denver Clan. So this was my film school. And suddenly I understood that when Pamela and Bobby Ewing are having an argument, there is a shot and a counter shot, and there is an establishing shot. I learned my filmmaking from the television show. And then the next step was that at some point, I think that was also my parents. When they understood I was interested in film, I think they started also to introduce me a little bit to European filmmakers. I think my father loved Ingmar Bergman, so we watched those films together, but that came a little bit later. Yeah.
Did it feel on any level like almost an act of rebellion to become a filmmaker in that case, rather than an artist, which was the family business?
I never wanted to be an artist, so that was not at all in my planning. The alternative would have been writing stories. I was always interested in storytelling. I tried to do photography, but I wasn't satisfied. I wasn't satisfied with the still image. I need the way that you do tell a story when you make a film. It's a storytelling with images, but it is moving, it's a story.
And was there a particular moment in that case when you thought, okay, I seem to be finding a voice here, when you kind of move from experimenting and playing around to actually thinking, oh, there's something, it's almost like another part of your brain kicks in and you think, okay, I'm becoming a filmmaker here?
That happened only a few years ago.
Really?
Every film is a sort of completely new thing for me. Of course, I learned how to do certain things, but not at all also. I mean, every story needs its own storytelling, and the disadvantage of being a real filmmaker is also that you know what can go wrong. I think that's the burden of it. And since a couple of years, I start to think about those, like the mistakes that are possible. I think before that, I just went on and did what I found was interesting and right.
So that's fascinating, because I mean, you're making short films in the 90s, and then, you know, you start making features. I mean, your second feature, Lovely Rita, is selected for Cannes. Many people looking from the outside would assume that you were feeling very confident by that point, and that you felt like you had a fully formed vision of yourself as a filmmaker. But it sounds from what you're saying, yeah, like you were still, even at that point, even in Cannes, you're still feeling nervous, like you're finding your way as a filmmaker. Absolutely.
I think there are a few things I can rely on. For example, my team. I know that the cinematographer I work with, the costume designer I work with, I know that they will find interesting choices. That helps me. But on the other hand, a new story, it's always a risk. No one who writes a film script can ever be sure that this is going to work out. I think every script and every film project has the perspective to be great, but in the end, not every film is great. So I mean, you never know what actually will be the outcome of what you're doing, and if any audience will be there to like it or to understand it. So that's also a reason why there's nothing to rely on. You tell that very new story again from zero, and you try to be as exact and interesting as possible.
How big a part of being a director is assembling the team? You mentioned the importance of the team and the kind of the other creative talent around you. How vital is that for any director to bring the right people around you and move from film to film with them?
For me, that is very, very important, because now we've talked about the fact that every film is new and you start from zero, but having the people to work with, of course, helps you to not go like really start from zero. Because, for example, when I work with the cinematographer, Martin Schlacht, we work on every film together. So he knows already sort of what I'm trying to say when I'm talking. You know, we have had so many experiences together, and when I do my little storyboards, I make some drawings of the storyboard, he can interpret them, for example, even if they are like, they look very simple and maybe the geography is not possible at all. Martin knows what I mean. He knows where to put the camera with which objective. So this is something, for example, I rely on a lot. Or my sister, for example, the costumes. She's the costume designer, and there is always a big part of the humor in my films comes also from the clothing, from the colors, and from the strangeness of the clothes that she chooses. And I really rely on the taste, that we have a similar taste, and she will always find the colors that I love too. I once worked with another costume designer, and it was a nightmare. I lost a lot of time and energy because you cannot explain taste. Brown is not brown. If you say maybe we should have a green pullover, but then it's not the green that I had in mind. So that was complicated.
You mentioned just now that you immediately kind of gravitated towards images, and one of the striking things about your filmmaking right from the start was how little you seem to depend on words. I mean, there weren't these huge, great speeches, and lots of people's early films are filled with dialogue, and it always felt very brave of you to step away from dialogue. But I wondered how deliberate and conscious that was to actually just to move away from words a little bit.
I think that was deliberate or conscious. I remember that when I made my first feature film, Lovely Rita, I always thought that the look, like the eyes are telling the story. It's, for example, the storyboard and also the editing is guided by who looks at whom or who looks at what. And so there's a sort of emotional chain that leads you through the film more than the dialogue. Or, I mean, there is a plot, of course, but it's more about how this young woman develops throughout the story, and her eyes and her look sort of determine the storytelling. And in the end, she turns towards the audience and looks directly into the camera. So she leaves us, the audience, with the question. And I remember that I was aware of that back then. I think I discovered that for myself with my first short film, Flora. Flora was the first film I made that I personally liked. The films before that were, I thought they were just practicing and embarrassing. But Flora was okay from my point of view. And what I liked about it was, again, that suddenly I understood it's a relationship between the look of the actors and actresses and the camera.
And yet sound always feels like it was incredibly important to you. If not dialogue, then sound. I mean, it always feels with your films like there's something interesting, audible going on, and it's just going on outside the frame. I mean, it's almost like every Jessica Hausner film is a ghost story on some level. There's always like a creak or a conversation we don't quite hear. Tell us about your relationship with sound and how important it is to you.
For me, the sound is creating the atmosphere. For example, there are some sounds that when I hear them, it depresses me. For example, the Formula One, the car race. The sound of a car race, I find it absolutely depressing. So I remember I had, in one scene in my film interview, I had that car race in the background. Some other sports, for example, are not so depressing. I once had a boxing match, like two boxers, as a sound element in one scene. It was I think two young people are kissing, and before they kiss, they look at each other, and it's intercut with those two boxers in the fight. So it's a contradiction also. I think sound is interesting for me when it's not just there to push or to emphasize what is already in the scene, but to bring some a new element. For example, a love scene with a boxing fight, it's a contrast. Or also in Little Joe, the music is, it sometimes seems to be an interesting genre music, but then it's not at all. Then it's becoming weird and loud and annoying and embarrassing. So also in Little Joe, the sound design is not only supportive, it's also disturbing. This is what interests me about it.
That's so fascinating about Formula One. I wonder whether it's because it's so repetitive. It's just, that's what it always strikes me as. It's just this drone. It just never stops.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about Lourdes, which you released in 2009. It's the story of a young woman with multiple sclerosis who travels to Lourdes less in the hope of a kind of miracle cure than, I guess, having a kind of a life experience, almost a sightseeing trip. We have a trailer for the film, so maybe what we'll do is we'll play that trailer quickly and then come back and pick up the conversation.
Messieurs, dames, s'il vous plaît, vous ne bougez pas, me faites un petit sourire à 3, s'il vous plaît. 1, 2, 3, cheese.
J'ai fait un drôle de rêve. J'ai rêvé que je suis paralysée. Et la Vierge Marie m'apparaît. Elle me dit quelque chose. Alors je me lève et je m'approche pour bien la comprendre. Et à ce moment-là, je remarque que je ne suis plus paralysée. Je suis souvent en colère. Pourquoi c'est moi qui suis tombée malade et pas un autre? Pourquoi moi?
Ou croyez-vous que celui qui a l'usage de ses jambes est forcément plus heureux? Prions ensemble. Seigneur, nous te prions, guéris cette jeune femme, guéris son âme, et si tu le veux, guéris également son corps.
Le Saint-Esprit, Jésus et la Vierge Marie sont assis sur un nuage. Ils font des projets de vacances. Le Saint-Esprit dit, j'ai une idée, on va à Bethléem. Jésus dit, Bethléem, non, on y est déjà allé souvent. Le Saint-Esprit réfléchit et dit, j'ai trouvé. Allons à Lourdes. La Vierge Marie fait un bond et dit, ouais, super, j'y suis encore jamais allé.
I mean, for people who haven't seen Lourdes, please go and seek it out. It's a fantastic piece of filmmaking. Jessica, I mean, as a filmmaker, I wonder if you feel a responsibility, you know, dealing with a story about faith, a place like Lourdes, which is obviously, you know, it's literally sacred to many people. Is there a weight that comes with that, or is your only responsibility to the film?
I think the responsibility is to achieve exactly what I wanted to say, to sort of to make sure that my film expresses what it is that I wanted to express. And normally I want to express that there is no one truth. That's the same, if you want, in all my films. In all my films, in the end, you have to deal with the fact that there are several truths, and for some people God exists and for others he doesn't exist. And I'm not the one to judge. I mean, I'm just here to show the different perspectives. And this is exactly my point. And I think with Lourdes, I remember there was a sort of pressure because I was afraid that shooting in Lourdes, that we end up making a Catholic film. I was afraid that during the process of filmmaking, there is not enough critique against Lourdes or something like that. And on the other hand, I knew very well that the film is not judging people who go to Lourdes and believe in God. Why would I? I mean, it's their business. And the film is just showing that some really believe and others don't. And the girl who is healed is one of those who hadn't believed very much. So there's a certain injustice or absurdity in that fact. But it doesn't say that I don't judge upon those who prefer to be believers. And I think also seen from now, that's actually the topic that interests me in every plot that I invent, that you cannot judge or you cannot see there is not one perspective, but there are different perspectives. There is not one truth, but 5 or 7.
And with a place that has the kind of, the symbolic power that Lourdes has, was that your starting point for the story? Or is the starting point for the story the character, the girl, and then you move her to Lourdes? Which way round does it happen?
The starting point was the idea to make a film about a miracle. And as soon as I had that idea, I knew somehow that it would be a story about a miracle that is doubtable, that the miracle might not be a real miracle. So the question about what is a miracle, that was really the starting point. And then I started to do some research, and I also investigated as a lot of stories and information about other places, also Fatima and Medjugorje, but then I sort of had the impression that Lourdes is the place of the miracles. They have a library, they have a doctor there who investigates the miracles, the so-called miracles, the miraculous healings. So it's a sort of machinery there. That impressed me too, that it's so normal. Like they have miracles every day. It's just a question, is it acknowledged by the church or not? And that already was a little bit funny and absurd. And so I decided to go deeper into that place.
I mean, it sounds like one of the reasons in that case the film works so well, which it does, is because you went in as the filmmaker with an open mind. I mean, you're not going into Lourdes trying to sanctify it or trying to ridicule them and mock it. You're kind of it's almost like a documentarian going in to find out what makes a place tick, what is going on here. Your mind is open.
I think the reason is really that when I make a film, I start with an idea that includes already the contradiction, and only after that I look for the setting. So the film is not about Lourdes. Lourdes just helps me to tell my story, and the story is no one ever met God, but we all hope that there is salvation, or that our lives make sense and that we will live forever. So there is hope, but we don't know if there is God. So that was very clear from the beginning, and Lourdes is a very good place, or for me it was a good place to tell that story. But also for my other films, I start with that sort of idea. Also with Amour Fou, it's also not a film about Kleist, it's a film about love. The same as Lourdes, if you want. It's a questioning of love, like Lourdes is a questioning of faith. And again, Kleist and his story is only the setting that helps me to tell the story.
And both philosophically and in terms of the story itself, I mean, as you've already mentioned, you leave the film with nagging questions, and the nagging questions are kind of the beauty of it, really. And that was true with Hotel as well, which is a film we've sort of glossed over, but another great film you made. How much of that is a constant design and a constant intention on your part to make sure that the film and the questions it raises stick in the audience's head?
What do you mean? How much is that? What?
Oh, is it almost a kind of a hallmark of a film's success for you that a month later or a year later or 10 years later, the audience is still wrestling with the ideas that you've kind of raised?
That's a difficult question to answer, because I don't really know what the audience thinks I mean, sometimes there are question and answer sessions, and I get an idea of what the audience understood of my film, and that's also very important. But of course, I don't know what they take home and what happens to them years later. But it is an interesting question from that point of view, that since my films normally end a little bit unsatisfying. So of course you're right, the reaction of the audience is an issue in my filmmaking. But I couldn't say that I don't know how exactly they will react, but I know that the aim of my filmmaking is to leave the audience with a question. And if they take the question, or if they just go home and say, I didn't get it, that's up to them. And I cannot I don't know that. Sometimes people are not interested in that sort of investigating endings, like questioning yourself. Others take it very interested.
How strange do you find that process as a filmmaker, that you know, festivals and screenings and so on, where you will then be meeting the audience? I mean, in a different era, you would make the film and then the film would speak for itself. But in the modern era, a filmmaker will often be going out and being confronted with people's thoughts about the film, people's opinions about the film. How comfortable are you with that?
It's okay. I mean, after I made a film, like immediately after, it's sometimes hard to really have a sort of distance to the film myself. Because after the process of making a film, which takes 3 years, I cannot, I'm too close to it. So the reaction of the audience is interesting, but it's also a little bit always the same. I mean, it's not really surprising, because the way I make my films, they are open to interpretation. So it's always like very different reactions. Some people understand this, others understand something else. For example, Little Joe is a film that you can really read from 2 different sides, and every Q&A I attended had exactly that effect, which was intentional. This is what I wanted. But so in that case, I was happy that people had different interpretations for the film, and for the other films, it's similar. Yeah.
You mentioned Amour Fou. I mean, let's move the conversation onto that film. It's a period story set in the early 19th century, based in historical fact, and it's a story about a suicide pact. Let's look at the film again in the trailer, and then pick up the conversation afterwards.
Es gibt kein anderes Leben als dieses hier. Man kann nicht wählen.
Doch, Liebste. Ich denke schon, dass manches doch gewählt werden kann.
Aber die Liebe, die kann nicht gewählt werden.
Marie? Würden Sie mit mir sterben wollen? Sie würden mich damit sehr, sehr glücklich machen.
Aber nein.
Aber mit der Pistole geht es recht schnell. Erst erschieße ich Sie und dann ich mich. Ich bin dabei, mich in Sie zu verlieben. Es mag seltsam klingen, aber ich suche nicht eine Partnerin fürs Leben, sondern fürs Sterben.
Sterben muss doch wohl jeder für sich allein.
Wie werden Sie?
Was tragen Sie denn in diesem Köfferchen? Pistolen?
Ich fange Schmetterlinge. O Liebste, wie nenne ich dich? Mein Goldkind, meine Perle, mein Edelstein, meine Krone.
Wie schön dann, dass wir beide nun erleben dürfen, wie es ist, wahrhaft zu lieben.
I mean, Amour Fou, like much of your work, is often very, very funny. which maybe nobody is going to kind of guess from just reading the synopsis of the film. I wondered, when you were writing, you know, how organic that humor feels. I mean, are you looking for wry, funny moments, or do they just arise? Is it like every story has everything is comic eventually?
No, I really look for that. This, I call it the tone. I need to know the tone of the story before I start the writing, and the tone normally means for me that there is a sort of humor in it, that it's I don't make films, my films are not only tragic, they're not at all tragic actually. they are, you mentioned the word, otherwise I wouldn't dare to say it, but I think they are philosophical. They are told from a certain distance, and it's a reflecting distance. It shows the way we live together. We all try hard to do our best, and we live this life. And at the same time, at some points you have the feeling it doesn't make sense, and the more you try, the less you achieve, things like that. So I think it's about the absurdity and also the ridiculousness of the longings and big ideas of us humans. And I think this perspective that I have in my storytelling, this is important for me to be able to tell the story. And for example, with Amour Fou, the story about a double suicide, I had written a script 10 years earlier about two young people who tried to kill themselves. And that script was really sad. They met on the internet, and then they went to that cliff and they jumped down, and then they were dead. That was sort of, I mean, it was dark, but I worked on that thing really for a year, and at some point I thought, I cannot do that. This is not what I want to see or what I want to make. And then 10 years later, or 7 years later, by chance, I was reading in a newspaper about Heinrich von Kleist. It was some anniversary, I don't know, and they described how he asked different people if they would want to die with him. His cousin Mary and his friend, and they all didn't want to die with him. And then he found that woman who had cancer probably, and she said, yes, I prefer to die with you than in pain from my illness. That was funny. I had to smile, and I immediately thought, okay, that's my story. That's what I'm trying to say. That you think it's so romantic and love is overcoming death. In reality, death parts lovers forever.
And creatively, does having that tone in place from the start, does that make the writing process and actually every aspect of filmmaking, does it make it easier? Because it feels like, you know, for any kind of creative act, there is so much choice. You know, there is so many directions that a story can go in. There is so much you can do with any individual character. When you have that tone in mind, does that make it more straightforward to say, wrong, right, this is my film, that isn't my film?
I always had the feeling there is no choice. It's very interesting how you said it. I always have the feeling my filmmaking is like, you know, there is this saying, but it's a Catholic saying. I think that the slot, like there is this saying, an elephant goes through a needle.
Okay.
How do you call that hole on the top?
The eye of a needle.
What? Eye of a needle. Yeah. I sometimes have the feeling I have to go through the eye of a needle. There is no choice at all. I can do no film or exactly this film. And that's sometimes why I need so long to find the story, because it really, but maybe it's the same you said, maybe it's just another perspective that I have. I need to find the exact story that pushes me through the eye of the needle, and then there is no choice. But you're right, that's easy then. But the beginning is difficult because it takes me about 1 or 2 years. I only write like short synopsis, 1 or 2 pages of the plot of my story. And I need very long time until I really have that plot. And the plot needs to be simple. There has to be the humor, the absurdity, the ambiguity, and the contradiction and the question in the end. So I need all those elements in that plot already. And then when I have it, it's easy.
And tell us about your relationship with research in that case, because your films always feel very, you know, they feel authentic and quite tightly researched and thoroughly researched, but that's a balancing act too as well, isn't it? Not to become overwhelmed by research and actually just end up kind of trying to find space for things in the film because you like this particular detail, this little nugget from history.
Yeah, my trick is that I write this short version, that what I just said, this sort of synopsis or treatment or expose. I write this before I do the research. I mean, I do an initial research maybe, but that's a bit superficial. It's just to collect ideas. It's more an inspirational research. I read stories, things like that. But it's not a research that is about the subject already. It's just to inspire myself. And then I write this plot for a year or two. And then when I have my story, when I know exactly what is going to happen, then I start the detailed research. Because then I make sure that the research cannot change my story anymore, because then I have the story. And the research just fills the gaps and makes it more lively and realistic. But the story is the story.
Yeah, your obligation is to the story. It's not to the truth, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the gender dynamic in the film is fascinating as well. I wondered how conscious you were of Amour Fou being a story about gender dynamics, and all of your films to an extent feel like they're about gender dynamics, and they're also told from the perspective of the woman.
Yes. I mean, it feels natural, the decision as a woman to make films about women, but the longer I am a filmmaker, the more I reflect about it also. And for example, in Amour Fou, there is one dialogue line that I always love to hear. It's when Henriette, the female lead, when she says, "I'm the property of my husband. I would never dare to ask for my personal freedom." And always when she says that, my breath stops and I think, oh, she really said that. And it's so crazy, because you normally think also from our perspective, a woman has to want her freedom. She has to be equal, and she should do everything she likes. And what fascinated me with Amour Fou was to think 200 years back. It's not only that line, but also to think that there was a time when it was so normal for women to be the property of their husband, that it's the same as, for example, when they talk about democracy. Democracy was a very new idea in Germany in the beginning of the 19th century. And a lot of people from the aristocracy, they mocked democracy. They said, how could the people vote? They're too stupid to vote, ha ha ha. So it was a ridiculous idea for them. And nowadays we rely on democracy. So this was also, it was an experiment for me to think how the things that they're certain of, it's again this example of truth that is not absolute. The truth, also the historical truth, like it changed throughout the years. And back then another truth existed than nowadays.
I wish we had more time to talk about Amour Fou, because it's such a fascinating film, but I'm going to move the conversation on to talk about Little Joe, which you released in 2019. I guess you would say that Little Joe is essentially a film about a genetically modified flower that can make people happy. That feels like a fair description. Let's take a look at the trailer, and then we can pick it up. You can tell me why I'm wrong.
We are entering a new era here. The first antidepressant happy plant. I mean, you can imagine the benefit for humanity.
Joe, look what I have for you. is a very special breed. What do you say we call him Little Joe?
What's so special about it?
It makes you happy.
Recently, I've been getting on really well with Dad. I do want to live with him after all.
What? It's as if Joe weren't Joe anymore. I think Little Joe's pollen triggered something. You're starting to notice too, aren't you? You're a good mother. Which of your children will you choose?
So it's a very obvious question to start with, Jessica, but it's your first film in the English language. Why and why now?
I think that first of all, I always try to sort of widen my horizon and step out of my comfort zone. It always helps me to develop something new that feels for me new. And I remember that, for example, when I made Lourdes, that was in France, in French language, I enjoyed the fact that French was not my mother tongue. And I had a translator on the set. I can speak French, so I could understand, but I'm definitely not fluent in French. And at the same time, and that helped me to sort of have a certain distance to what I see. And it was a very good experience for me. And I thought, and then after Lourdes, Amour Fou, it is German language, but it takes place in Germany. And after that, I had the feeling I wasn't really in the mood for Austria. You know, I sometimes feel that it's a bit by chance. I was born in Austria, okay, I was raised here, but my stories are not necessarily based in Austria. And so what I try to do with my films actually also to get them away from Austria, because I enjoy how do you say that something is not only true in one place, but for a broader humankind. Yeah, it's a more basic story that I'm trying to tell. It's not something specific Austrian. It's more about us, everyone. If you're in Austria or England or France or America, it doesn't matter. So I try to.
It's universal.
Yeah, universal. Thank you. And so I try to create a style that is in a way translatable. And if I really translate my script, I do the writing in German into another language, it helps me to make the story more universal. And then why English? I think that was a bit closer also to the genre that I chose for Little Joe. I was very much inspired also by Invasion of the Body Snatchers. It's an American novel, but it's in English language. I don't know, I had the feeling the genre of the plant horror it's easy to tell it in English. And then when I made the film in English, I liked it. I had the feeling the English humor is similar to the Austrian humor. It's the things we laugh about are similar to what English people laugh about. It's totally different in France. Okay. They would think we're obscene or morbid, or I don't know, they laugh about other things that we would again think that's not funny, that's just childish. So there is a difference in the humor, and I can go well with the English humor.
I'm just going to jump in to say, I mean, I've been monopolizing the conversation because it feels like there's so much to talk about with you, Jessica, but I am going to open it up. So if people who are with us today have questions for Jessica, which I'm sure you do, please pop those into the Q&A box, and I will make sure that I get around to as many of them as possible. It's interesting you mentioning science fiction and genre. I think I read an interview with you once where you talked about genre as what you called a corset for your ideas. It was this idea that you kind of, and that every film had a corset where you could kind of use the corset to kind of to hold together all of your thoughts and ideas as you moved from project to project.
Yes, well, maybe it's more like the corset is like the genre works in a corset. Like the genre itself has very strict rules, and those rules are like a corset for the genre films. And what I like to do is when I use the genre for my films and for my story, I sort of play with those rules. It's a certain deal with the audience. If they watch a genre film, they expect certain things to happen. And in my films, we go a little while with the genre, and then we sort of, we take a turn, and the film does not fulfill the rules of the genre, because the genre is very strict and clear. There has to be an answer in the end. You have to know who is the good and who is the bad, who is the villain and who is the, the hero. And you don't know that in my films. You totally get confused and everyone says something different, and the film also doesn't give you the answer. So you're left with those different options, and this is the worst thing for a genre film that you could do. And that's why I like it. I sort of start with that expectation of clearness, but only in order to make it more obvious that the confusion is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and without giving anything away around Little Joe, which again is a film that I'd encourage everybody to go and see. For people who haven't seen it, we won't spoil anything, but it feels like you're doing something quite upside downy with sci-fi conventions about the story, which are always, sci-fi stories are always about humanity putting itself back together again, and you're doing something slightly more complicated than that.
And I had very interesting discussions with one of our co-producers who wanted the film to be more commercial, and he kept saying, why are you so complicated? Make it simpler. Why don't we know if the virus changes people or not? And then I said, well, that's the reason why I make the film, because we don't know. If we knew, it's not me, I'm not the director of that film. You can give it to someone else, but you don't need me for that. The reason why I made the film is exactly that question mark.
I wanted to ask you about the kind of commercial pressures, actually, because, yeah, I mean, Little Joe, like a lot of your films, but particularly with Little Joe, it's an idea where, yeah, a producer could see that and think, this could be big. So how hard is it to actually resist that pressure?
Yes, now I laugh about it, but sometimes I sit at home and I think, oh no, I'm going to disappoint them all again. It's terrible. No, it is a pressure, because of course everyone, you want to please the audience. Even me, I also want to please the audience. But how do you please an audience? I mean, I am also an audience, and I personally like to see films that are weird and complicated, and where you have contradictory truths or aspects in the film. I like to see that, because in a way it amuses me and it touches my deeper soul or something like that. When I see a film that works well but is a bit obvious, and I'm not satisfied by that. So who is the audience? I mean, I can only think of an audience that is interested in the things that I'm interested in.
I wanted to ask about your relationship with actors. I mean, in general, but I guess specifically with Little Joe, where you obviously have this amazing cast, but it sometimes feels like, in a brilliant way, then the actors aren't the priority. The camera is doing something very specific, and it's almost down to the actors to kind of physically, to kind of fit themselves, into the scene. Most filmmaking, prioritizes the actors. It's everything's about the actors. So tell us a little bit about. I mean, am I right in thinking that the actors aren't always the biggest deal for you? And that's a brave step, if so.
Yeah, I think that's it's right what you said. I also had difficulties. For example, Sylvie Testud in Lourdes, she was, or she still is a star. She's in France. She was used when she is the lead role, the lead actress in a film. It's about her, and the camera tries to capture what she is doing. That was normal for her. And I, back then, hadn't understood that what I was doing was not that what she expected. So we had difficulties because I didn't explain it to her well, because I wasn't aware of that. It's not usual, you know, I'm only on my set. I don't know what the others do. So now I understand. After that experience with Sylvie Testud, after that, I always, when I meet new actors and actresses, I explain to them that my filmmaking can be annoying for them because the scenes are long and the extra in the last row is as important as the lead actor in the first row. And if the background is wrong, the foreground is great, I will still repeat the scene. And this leads to 20 or 30 takes of very long scenes, complicated choreographies, and some actors hate me for that. And so I start always with explaining that to the actors and actresses, and that improved the situation. But still, if you're then in that situation, there are still actors or actresses who do not like it and who complain very much.
I was going to ask how much you needed to talk to the actors beforehand and coax the actors into the performance in that case, because it sounds like you're doing double casting. You're casting for who will actually be good in the role, but you're also casting for the person who will actually be best suited to your methods.
Sometimes I cannot know that in advance.
Okay.
I have to, this is a bit a blind game, because I mean, I remember when I met Ben Whishaw, I remember that he said he doesn't really care what exactly, I mean, he does care what his role is, but that's not the most important. He said the project altogether sounds interesting for him. And he knew my previous films, so I think he understood the sort of filmmaking. And he was in other films where, you know, that the directors have peculiar ways of mise en scène. So he was an actor, he was not surprised. He sort of knew what was going to happen. But with other actors, you sometimes don't know if they will cope with it or not.
So I won't ask for names clearly, but you've had actors freak out on set.
I had what? Actors?
Have you had actors freak out on set and just be completely taken by surprise? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. It's. I mean, normally after a while there is a sort of. They relax after a while, because in the beginning it might feel as a bit as endless or something very terrible, but after a while you get used to this working this way of shooting. So normally it's only in the beginning, or I mean, for example, always the lead actress in my films, of course, she has to be there until the very end, and that's also exhausting in the end.
I'm going to bring in a question from someone who's joined us. This is from Screen Arts. So it's kind of echoing back to what we've touched on already, talking about Little Joe, but it expands it, I think. The question is, how did you navigate the more high concept genre for Little Joe while also balancing that universal humanity that you talked about? Because again, I guess it's that idea that you have this high concept, potentially high concept idea. You've talked about wanting the universal. Again, from a producer's point of view, that's where people think this is box office. So how tricky is that to navigate?
I think the important thing for me is really to that first part of my work, when I think about what is this film about, when I make the concept, and I write down the plot, and I think I try to be very precise, and I work with a co-writer, Géraldine Bajard, and we do not, I mean, I do the writing, but the important job of Géraldine is also the reflection. Together with her, we're like a ping pong game. I say something, she answers, no, I don't think that. I say this, she says that. So through talking, we reflect on the subject. And since all my films are about kaleidoscope perspectives, one character says this, the other one says that, we don't know who is right. So it's very important for me to work with Géraldine, who is not me. So we really have at least two different perspectives. And this back and forth helps us to create these strange stories that consist of different opinions. And since we take very long time to make that script, after that, I mean, of course, it's not nice to be put under pressure, make it more commercial, do this, do that, cast this famous actress, or use this great music. So there are a lot of voices suggesting ideas how to make the film very commercial. And sometimes the ideas are very good. If they don't harm my story, I take them on. But the most important thing is that this peculiar story is rescued until the very end.
And we have a question from Elstan Griffiths, who says, your film Hotel has been compared with the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich. How has art inspired your films? I was going to ask a similar question around Amour Fou and Vermeer as well, which felt like a reference point that was talked about a lot.
Yeah. Well, especially Amour Fou was inspired by visual art because since there was no photography in 1905, I think that's the time when 1805, beginning of the 19th century, there was no photography, so we had to rely on the images that have been painted, the paintings and also the sketches that have been made. And automatically you enter the world of visual art by doing that. But then it was also an important step after, like, we built the apartment of the family in Amour Fou in a studio. And I remember that the set designer started to arrange the pictures on the walls of that apartment like you used to see it on the paintings of that time. So the paintings of that time show you the typical interior with a sofa and the very balanced arrangement of the images on the wall. And when I saw that, I said to her, but that's now exactly what we saw on the pictures. Why do we want to redo that? We want to do something that opens up a different perspective. Right or wrong, I don't care. True or false, I don't care. It has to be different because then only the audience starts to be irritated and to reflect. So we took off some of the images so that the pictures of the wall, so that they're not symmetric anymore. And now you have, for example, the couch, and on the left side there is a small picture. It looks a bit by chance. It's not like the person who put it there is not a professional, but you feel this suddenly evokes a feeling of reality, because none of those people really were interior designers. They make mistakes, the same mistakes that we do. Also, we put the picture on the wrong place on the wall, and we wear clothes that are too big or too small or look ridiculous. And we try to do the same thing, even though it's a period film. And it sounds obvious, but it's not. Most of the period films are strangely perfect. They all took their clothes from the same costume shop.
And they all look the same. All those films look the same. Yeah.
They cannot even distinguish the different films. It's as if you watch one film. It's really...
Exactly. So Alison Fiddler has asked a question as well. She's talking about how much she loves the wry wit in your films, and she loved the colour palette in Little Joe. She raises this really interesting question, I think. Alison says, my overwhelming memory is the sense of delayed pleasure, delayed gratification. And she says, I think even the pink cupcakes don't actually get eaten, which I think is right. The pink cupcakes?
Yeah.
They don't actually get eaten in the end, I don't think.
One cake gets eaten.
Okay.
They sit in the canteen, I remember, because it was not so delicious to eat the cake.
But that did seem, it's a really interesting point, because I was going to ask about your approach to, I guess it's an editing question really, which is that whole sense from scene to scene. And then you mentioned this earlier, for the whole film, the whole story, you bring us in and out at unexpected moments, and things that we are almost trained to expect to pay off in narrative terms, or to take us to a specific place. You don't take us there. You take us somewhere else, or you play games with our sense of what to expect.
Yes, yes, I like to create confusion, and I do that with different methods. Sometimes with the dialogue. So I always have scenes in my films where people are discussing something and you don't know who is right or wrong. Normally in films, even if two people have different opinions, you end up knowing who is the right one and who is wrong. In my films, you don't. You can just guess. And this already is sort of, it gives a certain freedom to the audience that is not usual. I mean, it's not the usual way of filmmaking. And so also in the storytelling, my storytelling is sort of, it doesn't go in this direction, but it goes like this. It goes in circles, and the circle goes around. So you always have, for example, in my stories, some places are repeated. People come back to the same place. They say similar things, but slightly different. And then you think, but what? Is there something? So as an audience, you're not really sure if that, where does it really lead us, but you are sure that something has changed. And then you start to question what is it that changed, and what is the same. And in the end, you come back to the beginning.
Well, going back to the beginning, actually, Owen Evans has asked another question, which is, you mentioned earlier watching Bergman when you were younger. So he's wondering which directors particularly inspired you, actually, cinematically and aesthetically, he says. I've read you talking about Buñuel, and that always makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I would say Buñuel is a filmmaker that, I remember that I saw his film, The Charme Discrète de la Bourgeoisie, in a very small cinema in Vienna, and that was a very important moment for me, because I thought, I loved the way this film is about us. It's reflecting society. It's very funny, and I love the surrealist elements. I love the absurdity about it and the humor. And I think that was important for me. I remember that back then I was quite sure that I want to become a filmmaker.
And I'm going to go, we've got time for one more question, which I'm going to grab myself. And I'm going to go sort of even further back to the beginning. You were talking right at the start of the conversation about your parents as artists and learning the kind of the practicalities of art and the self-discipline and the money of art as well, I guess, you know, the everyday reality, as well as working as a director. You're obviously a producer as well. You know, you're involved with the production company. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that, so why you took that step to becoming a producer, but also about the different sides of your brain and whether there is Jessica Hausner producer, Jessica Hausner director, or are they in conversation with each other? How difficult is it to keep those two things separate?
I think I became a producer because there was not very much choice. When I finished my film studies in the 1990s in Austria, there were no film producers that I thought I could work with. I mean, it's also a little bit of a gender problem, because I was a young woman and there were only male producers age 50 or 60. I just couldn't imagine. There was nothing we had in common. It would have been completely absurd that I go with my script, Lovely Rita, to one of those guys. I just didn't see myself working with them. And then some colleagues from film school, they wanted to start a production company, and I was befriended with them, so I was part of it. So we are 4 producers of that production company. So we started it when we were very young, not knowing what it means. But the idea was that we are in charge of our filmmaking, because we knew from film school that you have to be in charge of the producing if you really want to make your film. Because otherwise the producer has the power to say, no, you cannot do it like that. You have to spend the money like this. You have to stop at this and that hour. You have to stop the editing because I think the film is ready. I knew that I wouldn't want to give up that power and hand it over to a producer. This was very clear for me. I want to be the one who decides when is the film ready to be shown. Do we have to reshoot? Do we have to re-edit? All those specialities I wanted to be able to decide. And I didn't think of money problems back then. And so far, no, I knock on wood, our production company still exists. And without bigger troubles, we have managed to produce our own films in co-production with Philippe Aubert, mostly my films, and now also with an English co-producer.
So we'll have kind of young directors and rising directors with us today. I mean, it feels like your advice is almost, as well as finding your voice as a director, you kind of need to find a voice as a producer as well, or at least be thinking in terms of being a production, and always have that reality in mind.
It was a very narrow-minded reality in the 1990s in Austria. I think that nowadays there are producers that are not fighting against their director anymore. I think that was back then it was the truth, but it's already old-fashioned. I have the feeling nowadays more producers understand they have to use the potential of the director and to enable the director to flourish. Then the film will be interesting, and then the film can be sold. There is no contradiction necessary. And I'm now working with a young producer, and I have the feeling he, for example, brings this sort of open-minded perspective, which is different from what I was used back then.
Listen, Jessica, we're out of time, but thank you so much for today. It's been kind of fascinating. You've been frank and brilliant and insightful. I've learned a huge amount. I'm sure everybody else has as well. So thank you. I'm going to hand back to Claudia to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Danny, for asking those questions. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Danny. I think, and I hope everyone agrees with me when I say that this was a very interesting and stimulating way to start the week. Thanks, Jessica, again for agreeing to do this with us. It's very interesting to hear about your ideas and your inspiration, your approach to filmmaking and the script writing. Thanks for sharing this with us. I think, Danny, that was brilliant question. So thanks also to you for this very stimulating event. I'd also like to thank Anastasia Mina from EUNIC London and Maren Holbein and Ibrahim Hussain from the Goethe Institute, and also Shira McLeod, of course, who helped massively with the organization of this masterclass. So a big thank you to you. Also, thanks again to our partners, the European Union Delegation to the UK and National Film and Television School. I think big thank you also to the questions from the audience. That was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I can't wait to watch more of your films and to hear more about your future projects, Jessica. We have some films which we will show from 11th to 13th of June. Please make sure you follow EUNIC London to find out more. And that's it from me. Thanks again to everyone. Pleasure to share this lunch break with you, and I hope to see you soon at some point in real life, and have a good rest of the day.